welcome back to the crux of the matter. How you doing, Landon?
I am so happy that I finished my genetics exam for the week. I felt like I got hit by a freight train. This week was brutal.
Yeah, this week was fine. It wasn't too bad, but yeah. So apologies for being gone for a while. We've been trying to sync up our new set schedules for this semester, and it's been tough to find free time, and the library was closed on the weekend, and it's hard to get microphones. So last weekend I went home for my birthday, and I was like, I'll just bring mine back. So we're just going to record whenever we want now. But we're going to get back on the bi-weekly train.
In other words, yes, they tried to stop us, but we won't go down that easily. Yeah. So we are back, stronger than before.
Yeah. So today is going to be about Reagan Fusionism, which is a movement within conservatism. I would say the philosophical basis, sort of, for a lot of the ideas you see in modern mainstream conservatism, and where it comes from, and all the things that fall under the umbrella of fusionism. But before we get there, this week, probably before this episode even comes out, actually, but there will be another video, so you can go back and watch it, and it will be The Case for the Gen Z White Pill, which is an article I wrote in January. I'm doing a video essay on it, so it's just another way to view that. If you haven't seen the article, you can go read it on our Substack, which we also launched sometime after, I think, after the seventh episode. Yeah. So, and, we'll just that won't be as consistent as the podcast. We'll just throw something up there if it's interesting to us. I've got a couple ideas for more articles, and if Landon wasn't taking 20-something credits, then I'm sure he would, throw something up there too. But yeah, so.
All in due time. So yes, we are expanding to the Substack. Go and check Riley's article out. It was a really good read. I enjoyed it. And also our YouTube channel, where if you're watching this on the video right here, you currently have found our page. If you're listening right now, go find it. You get this two-dimensional awesomeness of Riley and this two-dimensional semi-coolness of me. So it's a fun time there. But we really want to start with the big picture now to really reinforce why are we talking about Reagan Fusionism. Because to a lot of kids my age, they'd be like, that's just a political philosophy. That doesn't impact my daily life. And oh boy, you could not be more wrong, especially if you would identify yourself as someone on the right, specifically the Conservative Party of today's era, and just how it has infiltrated since the 80s, arguably even a few years earlier than that, into mainstream politics. So,
and there are a couple ideas you see from it, but just think of, what do you think of when you think of conservative? Not necessarily, the people who vote for Republicans, the people who live out in the country, you think MAGA hat, Confederate flag, lifted truck, and all that stuff. But, if you think like Heritage Foundation or something like that, like what pops in your mind, Probably some white guy in a suit like this, and he's just talking about these things, But it's just the sort of, basically the philosophical basis for conservatism we basically completely ceded the social aspect of where politics interacts, and we basically just made it free trade, free market, and capitalism. And we've really doubled down on capitalism being a good thing. And I think if you would have watched the fourth episode about the meaning to life, you would have remembered the bit that I had about, capitalism is cool and it does a lot of good things, but it's not a perfect system. Or that might have been when we appeared in the Bold
The American Dream. I think that was it. An increasingly controversial point today. But yes, I agree. Capitalism, in its purest sense, is quite a good system. Perfect? No. Winston Churchill would also say, he didn't mention it specifically about capitalism, but he'd say it's probably the worst except for all the others. It's
except he would say it's the worst for all the others, because it's like, have you seen all those memes of him? And he's like, it's just words slurred, because if you ever listen to audio recordings of Churchill, he's always talking like this, and he kind of slurs his words together, so you can't actually hear what he's saying very clearly. But yeah.
Oh, that is good to know.
It's not a good impression.
You'll get a better one later. Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, there are better ones I have in my back pocket.
Nice. But yeah, so adding on to Riley, what he was saying is that today it became the party of the economic kind of free markets, this idea of just trade. But really, what was the global and even United States focus of the Reagan era? It was the Cold War. And so Reagan Fusionism, as the name implies, Part one is Reagan, so Ronald Reagan, our president, during 1981 to 1989, during the Cold War and its demise. And then also the fusionism part, fusion, the conjoining of two disparate things. And what are those things, you might ask? It would be the Republicans/conservatives of that time and almost everyone else who agrees that Cold War communism is a terrible idea for society and for everyone in general. So that leaves only really the communists, like the very far anarchists/communists, out of this fusionist sphere, which means you have a huge array of political philosophy, of values, of culture as a whole, and it forms this melting pot that truly is Reagan Fusionism. But when Reagan Fusionism takes those completely varying opinions and tries to merge them into one political party, which some would argue is the Republican Party today, versus, and this would be up to maybe 2016, then you see, again, this loss of what are you really standing for. And that's what we want.
It's a big umbrella. I mean, like Clement said, it came about under Reagan. It was basically, it wasn't like strident anti-communism like McCarthyism. McCarthy was right, by the way, but that would be a whole different episode. And hopefully none of our professors see that, because they would not be very happy with that. But, the philosophical basis is basically anti-communism. The West is better, because it was a bipolar world. It was the United States or the Soviet Union, and you were on one of those two sides. And so it pretty much comes down to everyone who's not a communist, everything that operates under classical liberalism, which is basically the neocons and neoliberals, but basically the same thing, libertarians, social conservatives, classical liberals themselves, and moderates, people who just kind of wiffle-waffle about on issues or are not particularly clear on where they stand. So when we say fusionism, we mean like fusionism, like a lot of different things under one umbrella. So, yeah.
And to sum that up, I think there's a quote from Reagan's A Time for Choosing speech, very famous speech. I highly suggest listening to it or reading it. And it says this, so I'll quote, "I believe the issues confronting us cross party lines. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there's no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant heap of totalitarianism." And so he basically is saying there's no longer left and right. There's only up or down. And no one wants to be on the downhill. So we're all the party of up now. And so, what are the issues with this new emerging philosophy, and where has it changed things? And what have been some of the benefits we've seen? That we got out of the 70s economic crisis during Reagan's era, and some would argue that wasn't all Reagan's to do. Part of it was Jimmy Carter. Some would argue Nixon just got on the coattails of it. But,
I would say the thing about fusionism coming out of that era is the thing that I could compare it to would be the post 9/11 era for us, when it was basically oh crap, the Twin Towers just got hit, so it's America versus everyone. And at that time, George Bush's approval rate went up to like 91% in the aftermath of 9/11.
The most supported president in modern age,
Yeah, and then by the end of his second term, he was like 40% maybe. But it's one of those things where it's like you're being threatened, and so you have to unify. You have a nation, and so that if that nation is threatened, it kind of coalesces together around the threat. But what happens to the threat? Well, I think it's worth noting, the threat just goes, it just kind of collapses in on itself. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is that the command economy in Russia, the Soviet Union, it just got their economy got too complex. And basically the people who were managing it at the top couldn't adapt to it. The black market was way too involved in Russia, basically to keep up, just to upkeep the economy, basically to keep it running, which is where the Russian mafia and Adidas tracksuit and all that kind of stuff comes from. But there were a lot of problems in Russia at the time. And so, we defeated them, but they kind of defeated themselves, because communism doesn't really work. And so after communism really disappears as a major threat on the world stage, at least for a while. We can quibble about,
the
communism
hot pockets.
And, China's not the same as Mao's China. Like China right now is not the same. But regardless of all of that, there's no one enemy to unite against. And what do we have now? We have a nation that disagrees on fundamental things. This is one of the things I wrote in the case for the Gen Z white pill, is that a society ceases to be a nation if you don't have like shared ideals, you don't have shared culture, you don't have shared history, you don't have shared anything. You know, we literally disagree on what men and women are in the country.
Yeah.
Like how do you upkeep a nation that way? You know, it's bad enough that, you know, we can't even agree on what the main religion should be, but this is what classical liberalism is, in theory, supposed to do. It's supposed to be, well, we can put aside these differences until a later time as long as we agree about this one thing, which is, you know...
There's at least some shared value.
Human rights vaguely, and, you know, John Locke saying, like, there should be toleration for everyone except atheists, because...
Shots fired.
Which will never not be the funniest thing to me ever, especially if you've been on this channel for a while. You know that I'm not a particularly huge fan of atheists. But regardless, the point of classical liberalism is supposed to be tolerance. And now we've got to the point where we have two completely different cultures in America, at least two. There might be, you know, 4 or 5, depending on what part of the country you're in. But really, how does fusionism help us then? That's kind of a hard question. How do you ally with people who see no issue with, you know, like drag queen story hour for children? Like how do you ally with those people? And so it's kind of a hard thing, and fusionism, you know, for the time it was in, I would argue it worked. But is it really the way forward? Well,
yeah. Is it worth continuing? Yeah. And I'd argue that in 2016 was the most pivotal moment where I said fusion Reaganism, it died. Like the fusionism as a whole ended, and you could argue a little more nuance, so you can share your opinion.
Well, we were talking about this before the podcast, trying to nail it down, and I was basically saying that there are such things as fusionists. There are people who still subscribe to the idea, you know, just most intellectuals in the conservative movement who have been around for a while, Dennis Prager, Larry Elder, even people like Jordan Peterson, who, you know, he's a career academic. They're all classical liberals. And, you know, freedom of speech above all else, and freedom is the most important thing. Freedom is a very, very good thing. Do not get me wrong. Do not, like, get it twisted. Freedom is awesome, and I love it, and I love America, and go shoot guns and blow up dynamite and, you know, massive cars, and we're better than Europe. But all of that being said, freedom is not the highest value in a society. It's not. Like, it's a tool to get to other places. It's not the value itself, right? And so I would argue that fusionism, it's been apparent that it doesn't work anymore because there's a new threat. Call it wokeness or progressivism or
the new term we're trying to create.
Yeah, we're trying to find out a better description, because some of those just come off as pejorative and some of them aren't really accurate. And progressive is too big of an umbrella because, like we mentioned in our progressivism episode, that's basically the inevitable march toward utopia. And there are a lot of different movements that happen within progressivism, and some of them are even sort of right-wing, like Teddy Roosevelt would be another one to mention, sort of the exception to the rule. But we're trying to find some descriptor for the thing that you're already picturing in your head, you know, the pride flag with all of the inclusive stripes on it, and, you know, now it's got some red umbrella on it. I don't know.
But returning to the point, you mentioned something really huge. So fusionism's philosophy all centers around this major idea of the freedom of the person is the central and primary end of political society. And that's a quote from heritage.org. And when you said that, Riley, you said that freedom is the tool to achieve what we find greatest of value in the United States specifically. Even global context, it could be larger. But the freedom itself is not the aim. The freedom is purely that tool. And so often we get that backwards. We find all these other tools to try to get us freedom. Or conversely, in 2020, I mean, the pandemic made this evidently clear, is what are we willing to use as tools to then get to safety as the number one issue? And it is also intertwined. There's the surface level argument is, freedom or safety. But the deeper issues, those are not the aims. There's this underlying objective, and that goes back to episode 4, meaning life. The freedom is meant to do what? And the safety is meant to do what? It's not just to live your life according to how you want to, with no restrictions, / people kind of imposing on your own rights, and us who truly have the last shared value of human rights, but then where's that line drawn for how many rights there are? Because if some would argue, well, human rights involve a college education, free and paid for.
Freedom, you have to have the human right to the internet and all that
human
kind
right
of stuff.
to the internet. Human right to things. And yes, we can agree that these are good, beneficial things for society, but are they rights? And we throw that word around so frivolously in today's society that I really want to get back to, again, freedom and safety are not the objectives. And so fusionism, while it worked in the Cold War era, I think we'd agree, and it was very productive for people to become president like Reagan, and after that like Nixon, and after that Bush. I mean, we had 3, and then Clinton split it, right? So we had 3 Republican presidents as a result of that philosophy.
I think we had Nixon, Carter, Reagan. After Reagan, it was Bush Sr., then Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama. Trump,
yeah, so Clinton, okay.
And Biden.
So Reagan, Bush, Clinton. Okay, so like 2, Clinton split, and then we had 3 Republican presidents in that span. And some would argue fusionism. So,
well, and here's the thing, right?
Resonated.
So if you're on the right and the Republicans are who you vote for, and they were, out of the last 5 presidents, it's 1, 2, 3, like 4 of the last 6 presidents are Republican, and yet look around at the country you're in. Does it resemble the country of the 1980s at all, or even the 90s, or even the early 2000s? Not really.
No.
And it's because we were talking about this concept, and it's called the ratchet, and it's basically this thing we were discussing before. I can't remember who came up with it. I read some good articles on it. One by Orrin McIntyre, who I would recommend people subscribe to. Another by Mr. Prudentialist, who's like an anon. I don't know which way to say it. I've only seen it typed. Anonymous poster on Twitter, but he wrote this article basically describing the ratchet, which is that progress is a gear and it's always moving this way, and the left is the force that's moving that ratchet. And what the right does is it's just a little. If you've ever seen it's like if you've ever seen part of the inside of a clock or something, or like a little wind up Jack in the Box, I don't know, just something with a gear, and there's like a little stopper on it because the gear has teeth, and so it will just like click the gears will click the stopper every time. And that's what conservatism is. It's basically something that kind of slows down the progress and stops it from speeding up too far. Because what happens if progress speeds up too far? What happens if progressives get everything they want all at once? They try to enforce utopia, and there's some pretty good examples of it not working. And it almost happened in Spain during their civil war. It happened in Russia, which is the most obvious one, the Bolsheviks. It happened in a couple other places. But basically, if progressivism goes too far all at once, sometimes it will force a reaction, and that's Francisco Franco in Spain. Like that's how the left goes too far, and you get a Franco or Mussolini or a mustache man because the left pushes too far all at once, or the left wins because they were more efficient, like Lenin and Trotsky in Russia.
And some would argue, of course, Hitler wasn't including the left. They'd argue is alt-right.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
I believe in horseshoe theory. Some can argue.
I like IQ Bell theory, but same thing. But and so what the ratchet does basically is a new thing comes along. Let's just give an example. So women get the right to vote, right? And so after women get to the right to vote, then the right will defend for 80 years women having the right to vote, and then the left will say, well, we need to have gay marriage, and then no, that's unpopular all the way up until the moment it happens with Obergefell in 2014, and now the right defends gay marriage like it's sacrosanct now, and they'll be like, well, LGB without the T and all that stuff because transgenderism is coming along. And in 10 years, if we don't change the course we're on, there's no reason it won't be, the right saying transgenderism is okay, but the next thing is not, which is pretty obvious what the next thing is going to be. So,
and what is this term called where we as a society progressively move one direction?
Yeah, the left is the Overton window, which is the window of acceptable opinions, basically, has just pushed super far to the left. Just give an example. Look at all of ancient history and look at immigration policy for empires. And then look at what we do with our border now, which is basically just if you come across, then you're good, and you get to live here. And it's even being debated on the left whether people who aren't even citizens should be able to vote. because the right to vote is so sacrosanct to them, even though it's completely contradictory to the American founding. And if you told them that anyone who just turned 18 could vote, they would have surrendered to the British right there. So
it's point of contention.
Yeah, and it's it's just such a silly thing. And the Overton window is so far left now that you can't just say, I'd rather have some restrictions on immigration. That's like a leftist position in 1500. So it's just one of these things where if the window is going to be keep pushing left, you're going to lose. You don't like. There's always this argument from people who are David French type conservatives, right? And so they're on the right, and all they do is criticize people who are too hard on the right, and people who got upset when DeSantis went after Disney, and people who for 5 years got very upset with Trump every time he went and slayed a sacred cow in our society. And that's not principled. How is it principled to keep, why is losing our principle? Why is that our principle? Are we not allowed to win? What is the principle? And it's because freedom is our principle. Well, you can say that, but I'll defend your right to the death to say that. I'll just be honest. I'll be straight up with you right now. I'm not a free speech absolutist. I am a Second Amendment absolutist. And I think all political... yes, including cannon. I have right to own a cannon. But, I would say this. I'm not a free speech absolutist. I think all political speech should be allowed. But there's no reason that we should even hesitate with, here's another example of the Overton window moving super far to the left. Pornography. Why is that even hard? Why should we not ban that? There's no way it's good for society. And you'll just have the libertarian types on the right and most of the left, pretty much all the left. I don't know who on the left is against pornography. Maybe some second-wave feminists or something like that.
Well, there's feminists saying that we're going to create our own version of pornography that's women empowering. So it's always going to be a perversion of some sense to try to mask the patriarchy and some, I'm using air quotes for those listening, and for everyone else, it'll be just a perversion of it to claim that they're being more inclusive. And of course, diversity, inclusivity, and the E escapes me at this time.
Yeah. Diversity, equity, inclusion.
Equity, thank you.
Yeah. DEI.
So.
Sometimes die, if you put it correctly. But, the pornography is an example of how far the Overton window has shifted. Blasphemy laws are a thing. They've always been a thing in every society. And, every society will have things it holds sacred. And not having it means basically you get everything all at once. And, we can see that. We're sort of living in those times when the people who got probably brutally most of the roast and were seen as backwards by political commentators all throughout the last 30 years are who? It's a religious right. And, if you let gay marriage happen, there's this meme on Reddit that's it's a pie graph and it's all just a circle that's one color and it says, gay people will be allowed to get married, and it's all these other colors on the pie graph key that are things that are not going to happen. We're going to get a plague. World War III is going to start, and it's we're almost there already. So, and it's your kids will be indoctrinated by it. Well, that's happening. The rate of people who identify as LGBTQ, if you look at it by generation, has even Bill Maher, someone who hates our guts, has pointed this out that. Maybe, it's a social thing. And he does his little hand thing. If you're listening on audio, I'm doing a stupid Bill Maher thing where he puts his hands out and everything like that. But he'll do maybe we're going too far. And it's just duh. 20 to 25% of Gen Z is LGBTQ, which a large chunk of those are people who are queer or something. Because why? Because it gives you victim points. And so if you don't have anything else, if you're like us and you're a straight white male, but you're on the left, you're a bad person. So the first thing you can do is bash Christianity, because that's another thing. But another is, how do you get out of the white? Well, you can't get out of the white. And so you're left with straight male. Oh, okay. Well, you can mess with those.
That's, yeah.
So it's one of these things where, our principle shouldn't be, freedom is not a principle. It's a tool, and we should be in favor of it, but the left used to be freedom of speech about everything, and it was mostly so they could be as degenerate as possible on national TV and that sort of stuff.
Because they would then still have a platform that people could listen to.
Right, and now that they're here, they're not in favor of free speech at all. We need to have there's too much disinformation and misinformation on the internet. This
tolerance until the majority, and then dissent can be silenced.
It's that quote from Dune. Everyone's heard it, but it's when I am weaker than you, I ask for freedom because that is according to your principles. And when I am stronger than you, I take away your freedom because that is according to my principles. And the left's principle is power. That's the left's principle. It's power so that they can be allowed to do what they want and enforce their utopian view upon the world. It's always been that way, always will be. That's just what the political left and in some sort the philosophical left has always been about and will always be about.
And I'd argue on an individual level, if it's not power politically, because I know there's a lot of well-intentioned people on who they identify as left, and I'd argue that then their purpose of being on that is then for individualistic power, where they believe they are the god of their own life. Because you can't have it both ways, where I would argue that, no, I'm not in control of everything in my life. And that if all of society was formed around my beliefs in that, then there are issues with that conformity of no tolerance at all. And again, this is the whole nuance of they claim to be the party of most tolerance, most acceptance, most equality. And the conservatives will always just be too reactionary and not creating new things. But then once the side gets flipped, then the parties just flip often too. And then you say, oh, well, now they're no longer tolerant because then we're silenced, we're looked down upon. And then you have this scale that's constantly out of whack. And it is a complex topic.
And so you get things like what happens is the left is in total agreement that, let's say the left is in total agreement about gay marriage. They're not, like, gay marriage is not threatened by anyone on the left. But on the right, it's like half of the right is like, no, gay marriage is, it's a right now. In 2012, in California, they had a vote put up to the citizens to see whether or not they should legalize gay marriage. It failed in California, the bluest state in the country. It failed. 2 years later, Obergefell gets passed. And after that, like, it's hard even as a person on the right to even criticize it public. Like, actually, no, I don't think gay people should be allowed to get married.
I mean, you will get fired at major companies if you show that opinion. And it's only been 10 years. So there's either you have to sacrifice your old beliefs in terms of some judicial power, which judicial power should not be to create legislation, it should only be to interpret it. And also, of course, to say no if it exceeds constitutional power. But if we're seeing this overwhelming support, is it because people genuinely support these things, or is it because they're in fear? And I think any society where we are all fearful of the other side is not a society that's in any way healthy.
And this is one of those things, making freedom our God. Well, if it's popular, then I guess your views on these issues have to change throughout time. How is that a principle? It's not a principle if it changes. Like, it's not. And so people whose principles are, religion, for example, something like that. Like, here's mine. We talked about this on our Christian nationalism, patriotism episode. You didn't like the label Christian nationalist, totally entitled to that. I simplified Christian nationalism, which is the government's job is to promote good and punish evil, and people who are in government should be in submission to Christ. In that way, I'm a Christian nationalist because Christianity is true, and I take the Bible at its word when it says these things, and the government's job is to be the minister of justice on earth. So if something is unjust and the government is promoting it, then I'm not going to be in favor of it. That's my principle. So my principle would be the same 50 years. You can check back with me. I can understand my principles differently. There can be different interpretations, but the heart of it there is not going to change ever. And take it to the bank.
So where does this kind of tangent lead us back to fusionism then? And I think it comes back to, again, this overarching idea of where is society heading and where did this pivot happen during the 80s. So during this time of the Cold War, we have this fusion of people's identities and beliefs all into one moving party that was what we would consider united. The U.S. as a whole, we'd argue, is more united during that time because, again, there's this common enemy. Same thing during 9/11. There was a lot of unity from everyone to support this thing. 2016, split happens. The last 6 years now moving on to 7, has been absolute chaos because of media's kind of proliferation of this gap and this chasm between beliefs, identities, the poles widened. We see back in June 24th, 2022, the Dobbs v. Jackson
Yep.
case. We see that huge split. We see the new gun legislation that passed through that got litigated in the courts and then was passed out recently. We see new bills for gay marriage. We see new bills on basically every hot button issue that we see in society that seems to purposely be used to pit us against each other. And the question is, where must unity be sacrificed to then pursue the principles we hold dear? And we'd argue fusionism, if safety is the highest pursuit, then the Conservative Party lost its objective, and now it doesn't have any leg to stand on. Whereas the left, if safety and all inclusivity with no restrictions is the highest objective, then will any dissent from that be allowed? Because then you can't have it both ways.
Yeah, and it's just one of those things. Fusionism it was a good idea at the time, but like all human ideas, it's fusion. Here's one other thing about fusionism being a philosophical basis. It doesn't have a theological basis. So it's just kind of a temporary, it's more like policy, honestly. It's more like in a way. It worked for 20 years of American policy.
That should have come with the sunset clause.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just the things that fusionism is against, really, like, here's the thing about fusionism. We were talking about this before the podcast. One problem with the left and right, what the left does when they do purity spirals and they go through these phases, because political movements are always redefining themselves because they're always made up of all these different individuals, and there's questions about, okay, well, which individual is with us and which one's not, and these purity spirals happen to figure out who's on our side. When the left does purity spirals, they purity spiral to the left. J.K. Rowling literally went back in Harry Potter and changed the book so that there would be, like, sexual minorities in it. But now she's a feminist and she's against transgenderism, so she's just as bad as someone like me, who I'm pretty far right. Apparently, yeah. And it's just silly. Like that's how the left does the purity spirals.
Out-group homogeneity.
Yeah.
You pit us and then everyone else, no matter where you are.
But to be fair to them, they're sticking to their principles. One thing that the left does not do is they don't really compromise. When they do compromise, it's bringing the right over to them. And the problem with fusionism is that it's made it so that the right also purity spirals to the left. And they say, all right, we'll reach out to these people in our middle, Bill Maher, Tulsi Gabbard, people like, what was the name of that guy who was on, like Brett and Eric Weinstein. Like those guys they're literally old school liberals. Like why do those people get giant podcasts on the right? So what the right does is they say, hey, people in the center to our left, you can come over here. And even people who are on the right edge of the left, they'll welcome in. But people like paleocons, people like Pat Buchanan, who are, he's protectionist in trade. He doesn't think we should allow so much immigration because, Native American citizens are the highest priority. We should prioritize America above all else.